Members of the church know that we've just traveled through different parts of Europe with a very interesting story to tell, and with Europe still having our clothes. And if anyone is watching this who happens to work for Lufthansa, if you could please return our baggage, we'd be really grateful. On the way home, they had this opportunity to upgrade, and there were 2 seats that were available at the front of the plane. And the reason for the upgrade is because, I'm a little larger than the average, bear. And it really helps to have some leg space, in the travels. And so my son is just a couple inches shorter than I, and I say that specifically so that he remembers still who's taller. But we ended up taking the additional seats, and then they took my wife and they stuck her in baggage. They just put her underneath the plane, and my son and I were sitting, and they literally, I think Donna's seat was 45B or something like that. They could not have found a spot farther back in the plane to put my wife. She was way back there. So it was interesting because, here my son and I are sitting in one section and Donna is down in the other. And, for the time, 5 days or whatever we were running around Europe, we were very close. I mean, we did everything together, right? You get up and you're having breakfast together. You're doing all this activity. You're running around different places. You're going to different things. And I really found, as I was sitting on the plane with more leg room in the front and my wife down in baggage, that I really did, I missed her. I missed having her around. And it's not that the time we spent together was anything extraordinary. It's nothing like, we had any significant plans or we saw something we never saw before. It was just the fact that we were constantly together, me in her presence, her and mine, and just sharing the space and the presence was enough that an hour into our flight, I get up and make my way to the back of the plane. Now, as you can imagine, anything my size that starts moving in a plane gains an enormous amount of attention, right? And so we're wandering to the back, and luckily there is a seat right next to Donna that was open. And I sat next to her, and she says, "What are you doing here?" And I said, I miss you. It was that simple. I'm not saying this because it makes me an incredible husband or whatever. I have my flaws. What I'm trying to explain, or at least start to explain, is that the way we care for and treat one another is exactly the same way we have to be in relationship with God. We don't know any other way but being human. We're not angels. We're not divine spirits. We have a soul, but it's all captured into this physical body that has emotions and feelings and needs and concerns and worries and anxieties. And the only way we can relate to God is exactly as we are. And I think sometimes we think that so much more is expected or needed of us, but we're not built for anything more than what we are, how we are, in all of its simplicity. And I think sometimes our desire to want to be holy, and then how we judge ourselves about things that we do wrong or get wrong or make poor choices on, we come down much harder on ourselves because our expectations, I think, of ourselves are so much greater. There were thousands of Christians who never went to church. They never gathered in a space like this. They never even read or had a Bible, ever. This was right after Jesus' ascension and the sending of the Holy Spirit. Christianity blossomed not because of institutional rubrics, not because of reading the Bible. It was more of a personal relationship with Jesus. And that Jesus was experienced by those believers. it's not as though they just bought in to this wonderful thing that this man Jesus, did and said, and oh, isn't it too bad he died? But then there's a story about him rising from the dead. No, this early Christian community, without any of the trappings, any of the distractions, simply experienced the risen Jesus, and that was enough and sufficient to drive them forward. And so the questions they would have coming to belief in Jesus was, well, what are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to behave? Because remember, Judaism at the time, the Hebrew tradition, required them to go to temple and to worship on the Sabbath. And there were 667 laws, and every single one of those had to be followed specifically. If you did not follow those, then you were really seen as being outside and a sinner. And, so there's all these laws. And now all of a sudden, these people who are Jews and Gentiles are saying, what is it that's required of us? And their answer to that, the disciples' answer to that, would have been this story from Luke. It would have been the story that we just heard. Love of God and love of neighbor. And by the way, it's that simple. But the scholar, because he's trying to make points, is trying to trip up Jesus and wants to know specifically, well, who's my neighbor? Now, Jesus goes through this whole thing and brings about two people who should have, the priest and the Levite, should have definitely cared for the person. They're following the law. They're following the Hebrew scriptures. It's pretty clear that you're supposed to care for people who are hurt and wounded, and yet, because if they were to touch him, they would have been unclean, they've chosen not to do that, and they walk around the person. And yet, a Samaritan, the one that the Jews hate the most because of the tension in the land, this Samaritan comes along and not only tends his wounds, but brings him to a safe place so that no further harm is brought to him. And on top of that, he has provisions made and arrangements made to make sure that he is cared for until he's able to move on himself to go and continue his journey wherever. This Samaritan, the one who doesn't have faith, the one who is seen as an exile, the one who, within the population, and society would have been the one, the outcast, is the one who steps forward to provide all this. Now, I share all this because the early Christian community would have sat there and they would have said, well, that's crazy. You're asking us to do something and to act in a way that nobody else acts like. Nobody acts like that. How can you possibly expect us to act like that? What are you demanding of us? It's almost harder than the 667 laws. And yet that is the story that is told. That is the direction that is told. And the reason I bring this up is because I think as a church, we have made a terrible mistake of putting the cart before the horse. We think that it's about the institution. We think that it's just about baptism. We think it's just about being a member of a church. We think it's about the sacraments. We think it's about studying Bible. We think about, but no. Jesus' point was pretty simple: love of God and love of neighbor. We're the ones who have confused the whole process. And so as we're bringing Rebecca into the church today, as we make her a member of the church, as we bring Rebecca in, the responsibility is for the parents and the godparents to be examples to Rebecca, not quoting and teaching scripture, but that Rebecca should see in their behavior a difference between how they act and the rest of the world acts. They should be able to see in your lives, and also, regrettably, we're challenged as well. Rebecca's part of this faith community. She's going to be bumping into us, on Sundays, and we're going to be the ones that she's going to encounter. The only Jesus she's going to get to know is the one that we show her. And yes, we are very short on forgiveness. We are very short on acceptance. we are very short on love. We are very short on compassion and patience. And you know something? I think it's days like this when we're accepting someone into this believing community that we all have to step back and we all have to ask ourselves, can we be condemned and sentenced for being Christians or not? Do our lives give witness to a life filled with love? And it's not just love in the big things like sending gifts to the Ukraine and, feeding the poor at Thanksgiving. Yes, absolutely. But it is meant to be an everyday experience. It is meant to be an everyday command that we're fulfilling. It's meant to be something that we're actually living out. And when we're not spending time with Jesus, or if we've never had that experience of experiencing Jesus, we've been really good at, all of us, getting to know and how to experience the traditions, the institutions. But have we had a relationship with Jesus? Have we felt his presence? And if not, ask. If not, ask. Because it doesn't work the other way. It just doesn't work the other way around, where we're trying to behave in a certain way without having the experience of love in the first place that gives us the motivation to respond in love. It doesn't work the other way. And yet I think very often we use Jesus, we use the scriptures, we use church to separate us from one another. We do this and we hurt one another in Jesus' name. We judge one another, who's good, who's bad, who's accepted, who's not, who's loved, who's not, who's accepted, who's condemned, who's a heretic, who's not, right? We do this all the time, but yet none of that is our charge. Jesus doesn't tell us to go out and judge your neighbor. Jesus says to go out and love your neighbor. Jesus says go out and do not judge and you won't be judged. What happened to the basics of the tenets of what Jesus talked about? Jesus without compromise. Jesus without compromise, not the institutions. And so I am enamored by the fact that before all of this stuff, there were a group of people who experienced the resurrected Jesus, and they changed their lives, and they put their lives at risk because they were being sought after for being followers of Jesus. And the Roman historian Josephus writes, these Christians, they're known for their love of one another. It's a Roman historian who points out that the identifying mark of Christianity, a Roman historian, the identifying mark of Christianity was the fact that we loved one another. I'm not sure the same could be told now. But here we have Rebecca entering, and we're all gathered here to celebrate this event. But I'm not sure we get a pass without asking ourselves, how much do we embody the teachings of Jesus? How much do we actually experience Jesus risen from the dead? How much are we willing to sacrifice for unconditional love? Because everything else doesn't matter. Nothing else matters. And you can't tell me that the world right now is not starving and destitute for love. And who's going to do that if it's not going to be us? Where the simple charge has been love of God and, by the way, love of neighbor, and that means also the people you don't like. It means the people you don't care for. It means the one that grates you the wrong way. But you're responsible. Jesus makes it clear we are responsible to love them. It's our calling. It's our command. So we celebrate the wonder of an experience and an event where we accept people into the church and we reaffirm God's incredible love for Rebecca and her family and godparents and us as a community. And in a few moments, we will all stand and we'll profess our faith again. We'll absolutely commit ourselves again. But in the midst of all that, we must show Rebecca who Jesus is by our love. By our love. Not by words, but by actions that really shake up the world and make even us uncomfortable. So if any of you want to leave church now, I get it. I understand. I'll just wait and you could all walk out the back door. And otherwise, why don't we do a little baptism? So just for the record, I think Rebecca up until now really likes me. I think she's fond of me. She hasn't run away at all. But when I start pouring water on the kid's head, something tells me I'm not getting a Christmas card from her this year. I might be off the list. So with all of you who are watching, we're simply going to take a quick break to do the baptismal, and then we'll come back for the baptism, and then we'll come back for communion. So if you could just don't go away.